Okay, so the hands-on data visualization book, we're only looking at the beginnings of chapters 6 and 14, which introduce us to charts and gives us some of the framework for design and for avoiding things that will be problematic, generally speaking. So chapter 6 opens up with this chart vocabulary, just to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're looking at the charts and we're using our words. So titles convey the message or the measures, as the book stated. Technical writing tends to have very dry titles that are very specifically saying exactly what variables are in there. If there's a time link, they'll say it's straight up in the title. Things that are created for like journalism are more likely to have the message of what the person is trying to convey. So that's a little bit more of an information visualization versus just a straight data visualization. So how you choose to title your charts in this class, I will leave that up to you, but just be aware of the differences there, and at the end of the day, make sure that our titles are meaningful. If you had a chart that was looking at your sales data, if it just says sales data, that doesn't really tell you anything at all. So just make sure that the titles are detailed enough to be conveying something. Our axes define our scale and units of measurement. Make sure that you are intentional with your axes, that they are clearly labeled. The units are clearly labeled, and they're always meaningful. Labels on there that are oftentimes, if it's a line chart, you'll have labels at the end of your little data series here. That's often used for clarification, especially it might double up the information on the legend. It might actually replace the legend. Sometimes they use labels to replace the axes, depending for like bar column charts. For technical writing, you never replace your axes, but they're usually used as an additional clarification, especially if there's many lines. The notes section, super critical to make sure that you're using those to give extra information where needed. So in technical writing, this will oftentimes include any information about like margin of errors or acronyms, anything like that. In other writing, a lot of times you do have your data sources, credits, and things like that in there. They're very common to see, so just make sure that you're using them appropriately. For your project for this class, the data source is going to be already listed in your description. Like, you're not using multiple data sources, like one data source for one chart, one data source for another type of deal. So you won't need to put data sources in there. So your use of that section will just be for any clarifications. So in the end, you need to remember that even if a chart is embedded inside a much larger paper or article or book or presentation, you should be able to screenshot just a chart and get everything you need to know about what is going on. You need all the data, like what is this data representing? What is the story here? Everything just from a screenshot of just this much. All right. So moving on, how are we going to chart responsibly? So this is chapters 6 and 14, the beginning parts each. So chapter 14 talks about these categories of correctness. So your chart is straight up wrong if they misstate evidence, purely, whether that is you have the wrong data and they're doing something funky like that, or you're breaking one of the rules that you cannot break, which is in 2 slides for data visualization. That is straight up wrong. It's really rare to see stuff that's that wrong. Usually what we see are things that are misleading, which is where they unreasonably hide and twist the appearance of relevant data, whether that is through the use of data visualization tricks that you can use to make your things look misleading, or if it's by doing things that like fail to adjust for inflation, things like that. But to be honest, their stats are wrong. Basically, their data is wrong. Then truthful categories or truthful charts show accurate data. These have a wide variety of quality level. You know, you can have a truthful, accurate chart that does not follow color principles very well and don't adhere to accessibility, or, you know, are just like super basic and could be better, you know, but done more eloquently. Those are still truthful. So maybe the first step when you're thinking about data visualization is making sure that you are showing data truthfully, and then attending to the making things pretty aspect of things. Last thing I'll say from this chart or from this slide is I thought this quote from the chapter 6 was good. Just because data can be made into a chart does not necessarily mean that it should be turned into one. So in addition to thinking about, am I doing charts well, is also the question of, should this be a chart in the first place? Am I doing the right thing, or am I charting it in the correct way also? Okay, so let's look at these critical rules that will make your chart wrong. Bar and column charts have to start at 0. This is the bottom axis has to start at 0. Why is this? Length of the columns or height of the bars represent the actual amount. So you're not just comparing between the lines, the whole line represents the data. So you never, ever, ever want to truncate the chart like that. It is acceptable for line graphs and some other types of stuff. Scientific graphs might be a little different, or the way they treat these is a little different, but for general usage, line graphs can be better, actually, if they don't start at 0. I'm really sorry for hearing my neighbors, their vehicle revving. The second rule that cannot be violated is that pie charts have to add up to 0. Why? Because percentages have to equal the whole. And what is the whole? It's 100%. I am not a fan of pie charts. A lot of people are not. So we'll talk about those next week rather than this week. But if you do use them, or any of the variations of a pie chart, just make sure that they do add up to 100%. All right. So, best practices for design. This is basically chapter 6. So they talk about avoiding junk elements that can make things confusing. An example of this is actually on the right side, where it shows the cluttered version, where it has the lines on the back. Yes, it makes it where you can more easily like follow along the horizontal lines, but it makes it a little bit harder to read. So it's not really necessary to have those in there. The other examples that they're talking about were like adding like shadowing and 3D effects and all that stuff that people thought were really cool when Office first came out, and you could do all these cool graphs and things. Like, don't do them. If you're having like columns and graphs, they should be rectangles and pretty basic, just like what is shown here. Label horizontally when possible. Don't make people turn their head. These are really good examples. Quarter 1, quarter 2, you have very short text, so it's fine to have a vertical bar graph here. These ones would be very awkward to have, where the labels would be horizontal and the setup in this way, so they turn them into the horizontal column graphs instead, just so that it's easier on the reader, and that's the whole point. Sort elements logically, that's what this chart was actually from, is alphabetical versus a values sort versus a random order. Don't do random order. This is one of those things where you might need to rearrange the columns in your data set in order to order them in a way that will make sense for your visualization. So just being aware of that. And this is especially important when you have a very large data set that you have a lot of different columns and you have complexity going on in there. Keep elements minimal. Make sure that your scales are, you're not overloading with, like, you don't need so many markers for the axes in this one. Like, you don't need the, by the 50 increments. This one tells the story just fine with 100 increment blocks, for example. Keep the typography simple, so the font simple. Like, you're not going to use, like, you wouldn't use this type of font for a chart. Like, that's just not great. You want to use basic fonts like Times. Yeah, make sure that if you're using commas for thousands, things like that. And then using the colors and symbols thoughtfully. We talked about that last week. But here's another example of purple versus, like, these might be your favorite colors ever, but they don't really help and so they're just like bright for no reason, basically. So these are all best practices for design. I want you to keep these in mind as we're going through the quarter. And there's separate ones, similar but separate ones for maps specifically. But yeah, so keep these in your mind and revisit them throughout. Okay, and then best practices for truthfulness. So again, watch that axis. If it's a bar or column chart, then it needs to be 0. If it's not 0, because it's a line or something else, then it needs to be proportional to the data. So the examples in there where they had, like, the chart axis, like, totally spread out so that their little chart was like this little thing in the middle. Don't do that, obviously. Make sure that the axis is clearly labeled, especially when you are using a non-zero chart or axis. Again, like APA, for example, has very specific symbols that they use to show that you are not having a zero axis. So you have to have those symbols if it's part of technical writing. So make sure that you're following the expectations for whatever the publication is that you are going to be making the viz for. Aspects ratio. Basically, it should show the data in a neutral manner, so you're not intentionally skewing it one way or another. It can be hard to suss out whether you're doing a good or a bad job on this. The banking to the 45 rule is a common rule for lines. So basically, if you've got data that is supposed to be showing a line, then a 45-degree angle is kind of what you want to be shooting for visually, like the average of the lines. But at the same time, you don't want to skew your axes in order to make that happen, right? So, for example, if you're doing a scatter plot, you're not going to force your data into trying to make a 45-degree angle just because the banking 45 rule, when you should be following the axis rules first. Yeah, so then the last one here is avoiding the dual axes charts. So that's when on the left side of the chart, you have one type of data with one type of axes, such as temperature, one type of units. And then you have on the right side of the chart, you have another different type of unit, like money, like dollars, and you're having those on top of each other overlaid. That violates the idea of making meaningful comparisons, which we talked about last week. So you want to make sure that we are not confusing people and drawing comparisons where they really shouldn't be. Okay, so with all of those caveats out the way, we can transition into looking at what kind of visualizations we have at our fingertips, and when should we be using those, and then focusing in on the ones for this week specifically.